Chapter 1 of Brewing. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marianne Spiegel. Brewing by A. Chaston Chapman. Preface. Great is the debt of gratitude which the brewing industry owes to the labors of scientific men. It has been more than repaid by the immense services which that industry has indirectly rendered to the advancement of modern science. It may be said without exaggeration that in respect of the number of scientific investigations of the first order of importance to which it has given rise, the brewing industry stands easily preeminent among the industries of mankind, and that without the stimulus furnished by the desire to arrive at the meaning of some of the more important phenomena connected with the brewing of beer, both chemical and biological science would probably be the poorer today by some of their most valued intellectual achievements. In support of this statement it is only necessary to refer to the investigation of the chemical and other changes occurring during the growth of the barley corn, the elucidation of the mechanism of the hydrolysis of starch by diastases, the nature of enzyme action, and last, but not least, the numerous researches into the nature of fermentation, with all the wonderful chemical and biological facts which those researches have revealed. Whilst all this is indisputably true, it is unfortunately a fact that about no other industry do so much ignorance and misconception exist, even on the part of intelligent and well-educated people. The brewing of beer is regarded by many as an operation of a simple and more or less mechanical description, which is not of sufficient importance to merit study or of sufficient interest to claim a share of their attention. It is in the hope of doing something, even though it be but little, to correct this widely spread impression that I have most willingly accepted the invitation to contribute this little work to the Cambridge Manuals of Science and Literature. To prevent any misunderstanding, I may say at once that it is not intended to serve as a text book for the student of brewing, and still less the handbook for the practical brewer. In it I have only referred to methods of practical working when such reference was necessary for the purpose of affording a general view of the process, or appeared to render the application of certain principles more intelligible. I have in fact contained myself as far as possible to an explanation of the principles underlying the various parts of the brewing process, and have endeavored in describing these to employ language which should be intelligible to the well-educated layman, for whom this book is primarily intended. In dealing in so small a compass with a subject covering such vast areas in the dominions of both biology and chemistry, the difficulty of knowing precisely what to include and what to omit has been very great, and this must be my excuse should any of my readers detect what they regard as errors of omission, or consider that I have submitted the subject to unduly great compression. The illustrations of brewing plant have been very kindly provided for me by Messrs. William Bradford and Sons, to whom my thanks are due. I am also indebted to Professor Percival and to Messrs. Duckworth & Co. for permission to use the drawing representing the structure of the hop cone, and to Mr. Harold Wagner, F.R.S., for permission to use the drawing representing the structure of the yeast cell, and to my assistant, Mr. B.F. Sawbridge, M.A., for preparing certain of the photomicrographs. A.C.C. London, July, 1912. Chapter 1. Introduction. The origin of beer, using that word in a general sense to indicate a fermented infusion of grain, is lost in the mists of antiquity. Probably the Egyptians were among the first civilized people to engage in the art of brewing, and there appears to be good reason for believing that barley wine or beer was well known in Egypt at least 3,000 years before the Christian era. Herodotus, who is not always a model of trustworthiness, mentions that the Egyptians used a wine made from barley because there were no vines in their country, but this is clearly not correct, since wine was well known to the ancient Egyptians, and its use is recorded as early as 4,000 years B.C. It seems certain, moreover, that at that early period there were many vineyards in the Nile Valley, and that several kinds of wine were produced. Still it is not altogether unreasonable to suppose that in parts of the world where the grape would not grow, beer occupied the same position as wine in countries where the vine flourished. Among the ancient Hebrews beer was well known, and although the word shachar, used by Moses and occurring several times in the Pentateuch, might refer merely to strong drink in general, yet there seems to be good reason for supposing that it did in reality refer to an intoxicating drink prepared from barley. It may be mentioned in this connection that there is an old rabbinical tradition that the Jews were free from leprosy during the captivity in Babylon by reason of their drinking sisera, shachar, made bitter with hops. If there be any truth in this, it is of special interest as showing at what an early period hops were used for flavoring purposes. But it was among the peoples of western and northwestern Europe that beer was most largely consumed, and among the Gauls, Germans, Scandinavians, Celts, and Saxons it had attained in very early times to the position of a national beverage. Some uncertainty attaches to the etymology of the words ale and beer, but there is very little doubt that the former, Saxon ilu, Danish ol, is of Scandinavian, and the latter probably of Teutonic origin, both words being used indiscriminately during Anglo-Saxon times. After a time the word beer appears to have dropped out of use in this country and was not again employed until about the 15th century, when the use of hops became general, the word being then applied to the hopped in contradistinction to the unhopped beverage or ale. At the present day the two words are very largely synonymous, beer being used comprehensively to include all classes of malt liquor, whilst the word ale is applied to all beers other than stout and porter. Prior to the Roman invasion it is probable that mead or fermented honey was the beverage most commonly used in this country on festive occasions, and there can be little doubt that it is the most ancient of the intoxicating drinks of Western Europe. Next in point of antiquity came cider, and then with advancing civilization, beer. One of the earliest references to the use of ale in these islands is to be found in the Cenchus Mór, which dates from the 5th century, and which shows that ale was well known in Ireland at the time of the arrival of St. Patrick. In Wales, too, about the same time, ale competed with mead as the drink of the wealthy. Among the Danes and Anglo-Saxons, beer was certainly the favorite beverage, and its virtues are celebrated in many of their most ancient poems. It will be remembered that their conception of the highest felicity attainable by their heroes after death was to drink in the halls of Odin long draughts of ale from the skulls of their enemies slain in battle. It is not within the scope of this book to deal at any length with the history of beer, and it will suffice to say that from the 5th century onwards the popularity of beer increased to such an extent that from being the occasional beverage of the wealthy, it had become in the Middle Ages the general drink of all classes. The ale most commonly consumed by the poorer classes was doubtless low in strength and poor in quality, and in this connection the following lines from Piers Plowman are of interest. In speaking of the independence of the laboring classes, consequent upon the scarcity of labor after the Great Plague in the 14th century, Piers says, "Ni non halfpenny ale in none wise drink, both of the best and the brownest that Brewster Sullen." It is clear that at this time ales of several kinds or strengths were brewed, and in old documents of the 13th and 14th centuries the words prima, secunda, and tertia as applied to beer occur on several occasions. Later, in the reign of Henry VIII, the brewers were restrained from making more than two kinds of beer, the strong and the double, and the prices at which these were to be sold were fixed by statute. This restriction seems to have been withdrawn, for later we again find that several varieties of beer were produced and sold. The ease with which the operations involved in the production of beer from malted grain could be carried out resulted in the installation of brewing plant in the houses of vast numbers of the wealthier classes, and almost every housewife of importance may be said to have been her own brewer. During the 18th century this practice fell largely into disuse, and the brewing of beer passed for all practical purposes into the hands of the public brewer. At the beginning of the reign of King William, the duty on strong beer or ale was 1 shilling and 3 pence per barrel, and the price charged by the brewer to his customers, who usually fetched it themselves from the brewery, was 16 shillings per barrel. After our wars with France, the duty was increased by 9 pence per barrel on strong beer, and in 1694 it amounted to 4 shillings and 9 pence on strong, and 1 shilling and 3 pence on light beer. In the reign of Queen Anne the excise duty on malt, which had been originally imposed during the reign of Charles I, but subsequently repealed, was reimposed, and a tax on hops was levied, which remained in force until 1862. Towards the end of the 17th and at the beginning of the 18th centuries, the beer chiefly consumed in London was a mixture of heavy sweet ale with a lighter bitter beer and a still weaker or small beer. About the year 1722 a beer was introduced which had the flavor and general qualities of a mixture of the three, and as its chief patrons were the laboring classes and porters, it became known by the name of porter. This beverage made rapid headway, and in the early part of the 19th century it constituted the great bulk of the beer drunk in London. Thus, during the year ending July 5, 1812, no less than 1,318,037 barrels of porter were brewed in London by the 12 principal firms then in existence, whilst during the same period only about 105,000 barrels of ale were produced. In 1880 there was a complete revision of the mode of taxation to which brewers were subjected, the most important change being the replacement of the duty on malt by a duty on the finished beer, which was fixed at 6 shillings and 3 pence for each barrel of 36 gallons, at a standard original gravity of 1057 degrees, less an allowance of 6% for unavoidable waste in the manufacturing operations. During succeeding years this duty was subject to many changes, and at the time of writing it amounts to 7 shillings and 9 pence per barrel of an original gravity of 1055 degrees, with an allowance of 6% for waste. By original gravity is meant the specific gravity of the wort prior to fermentation, and it is on this that the brewer is taxed, the calculation being always made to a standard specific gravity of 1055 degrees. At the present time many different kinds of beer are brewed in this country, of which the more important are mild ale, porter, pale ale, bitter ale, and stout. In addition to these, which are sold both in cask and in bottle, there are less important varieties, peculiar to certain localities, as well as lager beers produced by the decoction system of brewing which is so widely adopted on the continent and in America. The great bulk of the beer made in this country is consumed by the working classes whose staple beverages are the so-called mild ale and porter. The mild ale is a lightly hopped beer of medium gravity and of full sweet flavor, which in London is usually drunk when quite new, but which in the country is occasionally kept on draught for 1 or 2 months. Porter is a dark-colored beer usually of about the same original gravity as the mild ale, and which is devoid of any pronounced hop flavor. Stout is a black beer of higher gravity than porter, which it resembles in being somewhat lightly hopped. Its flavor varies greatly, according to the locality in which it is sold, being sometimes, as in London, sweet and luscious, and at others, as in Ireland, devoid of any pronounced sweetness, or dry. Bitter beers, as the name implies, are characterized by a marked flavor of the hop, and are brewed of several strengths. Pale ale, which includes ales intended for export and for storage, is the name usually given to beers of the highest quality. In original gravity the beers of this class vary very greatly, but they are always pale in color and are almost invariably brewed from the finest materials, and represent in a sense the highest product of the brewer's art. In connection with the above general descriptions, it should be pointed out that no sharp lines of demarcation can be drawn between any of the varieties mentioned. These overlap very considerably, and in different parts of the country the same name is often applied to beers of very different characters. The history of a beverage which in its various forms has played such an important part in our national and social life for so many centuries is in the highest degree fascinating, and to those who are interested I commend any or all of the historical works, the titles of which are given in the list on pages 127 and 128. End of chapter 1. Of Brewing by A. Chaston Chapman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Marianne. Chapter 2. Materials used in brewing. The two essential chemical processes involved in the manufacture of beer are first, the conversion of starch by means of diastases into certain soluble substances, one of which is a fermentable sugar, and secondly, the decomposition of this sugar by means of the yeast organism into alcohol and carbon dioxide gas. It is clear from this that the main raw material must be one containing starch, and that it should if possible contain the necessary converting agent, diastases. Both these conditions are satisfied in the case of certain germinating seeds, and although many have at various times been tried, long experience has showed that germinated barley possesses to the fullest degree the various properties necessary for the brewing of beer. Among other cereals which are occasionally employed are maize, rice, oats, and wheat, but these are always used, when used at all, in conjunction with a large proportion of germinated barley, or, to give it its technical name, malt. Further reference will be made to these cereals later, and for the present I will confine myself to the consideration of barley malt, which is the brewer's chief raw material. Although it is not within the scope of this book to deal at any length with the process of converting barley into malt, some reference to the subject is necessary to ensure a proper understanding of the mashing process, which is one of the most important parts of the whole brewing procedure. The process of malting may be said briefly to consist in artificially inducing the germination of the grain, and when sufficient growth has taken place, in stopping it by the application of heat. Simple as this bare statement may appear, the chemical and physiological changes occurring during the conversion of barley into malt are highly complex, and notwithstanding the vast amount of study devoted to their elucidation, are even now very far from being fully understood. Thanks, however, to the labors of Brown and Morris, and others, the general character of these changes is tolerably clear. If a few corns of barley are bitten between the teeth, they will be found to be very hard, whilst malt corns, tested similarly, will be found to be mealy and friable, and to break down readily. Again, if a handful of barley is ground up and treated with a little warm water, no apparent change will occur, and even at the end of some hours, the addition of a little iodine solution will give the blue color characteristic of starch. If, on the other hand, some ground malt be treated in the same way, it will soon be evident that some chemical change is taking place, for the mixture, if fairly thick to commence with, will rapidly become more liquid, and the solution obtained after straining off the solid matter will be found to have a pleasant sweet flavor, and on adding a little iodine solution, there will be no blue coloration, showing that the starch has disappeared. It is clear then that some very marked changes have attended the transformation of the barley into malt, and these are of the utmost importance to the brewer. The above simple experiment shows that the malt differs from the barley from which it was made, chiefly in containing an active substance which is capable, under appropriate conditions, of converting the starch of the grain into soluble, sweet-tasting products, and one object of the malting process is to produce these substances. But there is another and more important difference between the two. As has been pointed out above, the barley is hard and vitreous, whilst the resulting malt is soft and friable, and a second object of the malting process is to bring about this change in the grain. A third object is to give the malt the necessary flavor, which is accomplished by heating it to the requisite temperature on a specially constructed kiln. We will now consider briefly the meaning of the above mentioned changes and how they are brought about by the maltster. A grain of barley consists essentially of two parts, the main starchy portion, known as the endosperm, and a smaller part at one end of the corn, known as the embryo. During the natural germination of the corn in the earth, the embryo, which as the name implies is the rudimentary plant, commences to develop, and the starch of the endosperm is the provision made by nature for the nutrition of the growing plant until such time as the first green leaves are formed and the rootlets have sufficiently developed to permit of their obtaining food from the soil. It is this process which the maltster imitates and turns to his own ends. In the earth the vital changes are initiated or developed by the absorption of moisture, and the first part of the malting process consists in soaking the grain in water until it has absorbed sufficient to start the growth. It is then spread on floors and the germination allowed to proceed until the plumule has proceeded about 3/4 of the entire length of the corn. It is during this period that the important change mentioned above takes place. In the barley corn, the reserve materials are not directly available for the nutrition of the growing germ, since both the starch and the greater part of the nitrogenous substances, proteins, are insoluble and consequently not diffusible through the cellular structures to the germ where they are required. In the barley itself, certain active nitrogen-containing substances occur known as enzymes, and others are developed during germination. These enzymes are the natural agents necessary for the conversion of the insoluble reserve food material into soluble, diffusible, and assimilable substances, and we shall see a little later how necessary they are to the brewer in his operations. Between the embryo and the starchy endosperm there is a cellular body known as the scutellum, the function of which is to secrete the necessary enzymes, and which becomes active in this sense as soon as germination has commenced. In addition to this, the alurona layer is also active in the secretion of these enzymes. The starch of the grain is not in a free condition, but exists in the form of granules packed in innumerable vegetable cells, and the walls of these cells have to be attacked before the contained starch is capable of being acted upon by the enzyme diastases. This is effected by means of a second enzyme known as cytase, which attacks the cellulose walls, either dissolving them or softening and rendering them more permeable to the diastases, which is then able to convert the starch into the soluble matters needed for the nutrition of the growing germ. This solvent or disintegrating action, its precise extent is still a matter of some uncertainty, of the cytase on the cellular structures of the endosperm explains the conversion of the hard and vitreous barley into the tender and friable malt. At the same time, diastases is developed in considerable quantity, and a portion of the starch is used up by the young plant. It is, of course, to the interest of the maltster to reduce this consumption of starch to a minimum, as it is later on required by the brewer, and therefore as soon as the action on the cell walls, or modification, as it is technically termed, is sufficiently complete, which is usually the case when the plumule has grown nearly the length of the corn, further action is stopped by drying the grain, first on the malting floor itself and then on a kiln, either by direct combustion products of coal or coke, or, as on the continent, by means of hot air. In addition to the solvent action of cytase on the cell walls of the endosperm and the development of diastase, so necessary for the subsequent conversion of the starch in the brewery, there are other changes occurring, one of which is of a considerable practical importance. This is the conversion of a proportion of the insoluble proteins of the grain into soluble, diffusible, and chemically simpler substances, such as petroses, peptones, and amino acids. These, which are intended by nature for the needs of the growing plant, are of great importance to the brewer, as we shall see later, particularly in connection with the nutrition of the yeast during the process of fermentation. This protein conversion, or proteolysis, is effected by another enzyme, or possibly by more than one, the action partly resembling that of trypsin and partly that of pepsin, or peptase, the two enzymes present in the pancreas and stomach of animals, and which are responsible for the breaking down of the complex insoluble proteins during the process of animal digestion. Whilst only about 20% of the total nitrogen of barley is soluble, more than 40% of the nitrogen of the resulting malt can dissolve in water, the increase being chiefly due to the production of amides and aminobodies, such as asparagine. The changes taking place in the various nitrogenous bodies are illustrated by the following analysis of Bungener and Fries. Total nitrogen: barley 1.690%, malt 1.580%. Nitrogen as albumin: barley 0.161%, malt 0.230%. Nitrogen as peptone: barley 0.040%, malt 0.060%. Nitrogen as amides: barley 0.206%, malt 0.534%. Total soluble nitrogen: barley 0.355%, malt 0.642%. The germinated grain, having been partially dried on the growing floor, is transferred to the kiln where growth is effectually arrested and where it acquires a pleasant biscuity flavor. Frequent use has also been made of the word enzyme, and perhaps it may be well to define a little more clearly what is meant, particularly having regard to the all-important part which these substances play in the processes of malting and brewing. The enzymes constitute a class of bodies which are of universal occurrence in all living organisms, whether animal or vegetable, and which are of supreme importance to the life and well-being of these organisms. Briefly, their function may be said to consist in rendering soluble and available for nutrition the various insoluble reserve materials on which the life of the organism depends. Thus, we have starch-converting enzymes, or diastases, cellulose-converting enzymes, or cystases, sugar-converting enzymes, such as invertase and maltase, protein-converting enzymes, or proteolysis, fat-converting enzymes, or lipases, and finally the enzyme which splits up sugar into alcohol and carbon dioxide gas, fermentation, or zymase. The enzymes are all nitrogen-containing substances of albuminoid character, and it is one of their most noteworthy characteristics that but very small quantities are needed for the conversion of relatively enormous quantities of the various substances on which they exert their specific actions. Technologically, this point is one of the highest importance, although the precise manner in which they exert their activity is not understood. They are soluble in water and resemble certain of the proteins such as egg albumin in being coagulated by heat. With this coagulation their chemical activity disappears, and this, as we shall see, is also a matter of the highest technological moment. The enzymes are not all equally sensitive to the destructive effect of heat, but all are destroyed by the presence of water at temperatures short of that of boiling water, and it may be said roughly that a temperature of about 80 degrees to 90 degrees Celsius usually marks the limit of their activity. On the other hand, they will withstand a temperature of 120 degrees Celsius or even more when completely dry. They are capable of acting at fairly low temperatures, but for every enzyme there is a temperature, or rather a limited range of temperature, within which it is most active. Thus, the diastase of malt, which converts starch into soluble sugar and other products, functions most actively at about 50 degrees to 55 degrees Celsius. And the enzyme invertase, which converts cane sugar into invert sugar, is most active at about 55 degrees Celsius. The enzymes are also exceedingly sensitive to the presence of very small quantities of many chemical substances, and whilst the majority act most readily in faintly acidic solutions, a few, e.g., trypsin, exert their specific activities best in faintly alkaline media. We have seen that during the conversion of the barley into malt, the more important changes which occur are (a) the development of the enzymes, diastases, necessary for the subsequent conversion of the insoluble starch into soluble and partially fermentable products, (b) the modification of the cellular structures of the endosperm by means of the enzyme cytase, (c) the conversion of insoluble proteins into simpler and soluble nitrogenous products, and (d) the production by kilning of a pleasant biscuity flavor. Instead of the hard, vitreous barley, we have now a mealy, friable material containing a large proportion of the original starch. Some is lost during malting by conversion into carbon dioxide and water as the result of the vital respiratory processes. And at the same time the enzymes necessary for effecting the important transformation of that starch, which occurs during the process of mashing, and which will be dealt with in a subsequent chapter. It has already been pointed out that it is one of the characteristics of the enzymes as a class that they are able to bring about an amount of chemical change which is enormously great in relation to the actual weight of the active agent concerned, and during the germination process a very much larger amount of diastase is formed in the growing grain than is needed for the brewer's purpose. One object of the kilning process is, therefore, to destroy or to restrict the activity of a great deal of this diastase, leaving just as much in the finished malt as may be necessary for the purpose for which it is to be employed. This depends to a great extent on the class of beer for which the malt is to be used. A malt containing more active diastase, and therefore kilned at comparatively low temperatures, being required for pale ales than for mild ales or black beers. Even after the severe restriction of diastase which occurs in the kiln, barley malt contains much more diastase than is necessary for the conversion of its own starch, and in consequence other starch-containing materials may be used in conjunction with malt should their employment for one reason or another be deemed desirable. Such materials are maize, rice, oats, and, on rare occasions, other cereals. The maize and rice are usually submitted to a preparatory purifying and cooking process before being supplied to the brewer, and in the form of flaked maize and flaked rice represent very pure and concentrated brewing materials, containing as they do from 75% to more than 80% of starch. The products obtained by the action of diastase on the starch of these materials are the same as those resulting from the conversion of the starch of barley malt itself, but they yield to the worts much smaller proportions of soluble nitrogenous substances, and it is to this fact that their utility as malt adjuncts is largely due. Since alcohol is one of the most significant and important constituents of beer, it is clear that certain sugar products which are capable of yielding that substance on fermentation might be used in place of a certain proportion of the malt. It will be seen later that during the mashing process the starch of the malt is converted partly into fermentable sugar maltose, and that this is split up during the process of fermentation into alcohol and carbon dioxide gas. Since other sugars such as dextrose and levulose undergo the same decomposition when submitted to the action of yeast, there is clearly no reason why a proportion of these sugars should not be employed by the brewer, assuming, of course, that in the form in which they are used they are perfectly wholesome, and that they are found to yield good results in respect of the flavor and character of the finished beer. Cane sugar itself is not directly fermentable, but is first converted by the enzyme invertase contained in the yeast cell into invert sugar, which then undergoes decomposition into alcohol and carbon dioxide. Cane sugar may therefore be directly employed as a brewing material, but inasmuch as its use is thought by many brewers to conduce to yeast weakness, it is more usual to employ the invert sugar made from it. On the manufacturing scale, the invert sugar is prepared by heating a solution of cane sugar with a small amount of a mineral acid until the desired change is complete. The acid is then neutralized, and the solution, after more or less decolorization, is evaporated in a vacuum pan to the consistency of a syrup. In this process the cane sugar undergoes hydrolysis and is converted into a mixture of dextrose and levulose in nearly equal proportions, which is known as invert sugar. The change may be represented by the following equation: cane sugar C12H22O11 plus water H2O equals a combination of dextrose C6H12O6 plus levulose C6H12O6, together invert sugar. As used by the brewer, invert sugar is a product closely resembling golden syrup in appearance and in flavor. But when allowed to stand for some time it sets to a soft solid mass owing to the crystallization of the dextrose, the levulose, which crystallizes only with great difficulty, remaining in a syrupy condition. The commercial syrups usually contain about 75% of invert sugar, the balance consisting of water, with small quantities of cane sugar and a little mineral water. In its composition, therefore, it is very similar to honey. The only other sugar product which is at all largely used in brewing is glucose. This is prepared by heating the starch obtained from various sources maize, sago, potato, rice with dilute mineral acid until the required amount of conversion has taken place. In this process the starch is converted first into maltose and dextrin, and finally, if the action be allowed to continue for a sufficient time, entirely into dextrose. The chemistry of this change is not, in point of fact, quite so simple as might appear from the above statement, small quantities of other and unfermentable carbohydrates being formed at the same time. Footnote: the term carbohydrate is a generic term applied to a group of compounds, some of which are very widely distributed in nature, and which include such important substances as cane sugar, milk sugar, starch, and cellulose. The more important members of the group contain either 6 or a multiple of 6 carbon atoms in the molecule, and in all cases the hydrogen and oxygen atoms are present in the relative proportions in which they unite to form water. The expression carbohydrate was obviously designed to call attention to the fact that the composition of these substances may be represented by the general formula CX(H2O)Y. And whilst the word is certainly not free from objection, it has at least the sanction of long and general usage, and is, after all, a convenient one by which to designate a group of important compounds closely related to one another and having many properties in common. The action is usually allowed to proceed until the whole of the dextrin has disappeared, and the resulting product therefore consists substantially of a mixture of the two sugars, dextrose and maltose. Of course, in the process of manufacture, the acid used is neutralized and the solution decolorized, as in the case of invert sugar. Thus prepared, glucose or starch sugar forms a white or yellowish solid mass possessed of far less sweetness than invert sugar, and containing about 65 to 70% of fermentable sugars. By restricting the action of the acid in the manufacture of glucose, a product may be obtained containing a considerable proportion of dextrin and smaller quantities of dextrose and maltose. This product, which occurs in commerce in the form of a thick, colorless syrup, is occasionally used in brewing, but finds its chief employment in the manufacture of confectionery. In the brewing of stouts and porters, certain proportions of highly colored malts and of caramel are employed. The malts are manufactured either by kilning the germinated barley at a high temperature over a fire of burning wood (brown malt), or by roasting barley or ordinary malt in a cylinder such as coffee is roasted in (black malt). These materials communicate to the beers in which they are used not only a considerable amount of color, but also a pleasant and characteristically empyreumatic flavor. In place of a proportion of these colored malts, caramel prepared by the action of heat on glucose or cane sugar is often used. With the important exception of water, hops, and yeast, which will be dealt with more conveniently in subsequent chapters, the above may be said to constitute the materials from which beer is brewed. End of chapter 2. Brewing by A. Chaston Chapman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Marianne. Chapter 3. Mashing. In a few words, the object of this most important operation may be said to be the conversion by diastase of the starch of the malt or other grain, when this is used, partly into fermentable sugar, and partly into other substances which are either unfermentable or which only undergo fermentation with considerable difficulty. Simple as this statement may appear to be, the chemical changes involved in the process are exceedingly complex, and notwithstanding the immense amount of labor which has been for many years devoted to their study, it cannot be said that they are even now fully understood. Sufficient has, however, been learned in regard to the chemistry of the transformation of starch at the instant of diastase to furnish us with a tolerably clear insight into the nature of the changes occurring during the mashing process, and to serve as a reliable guide to the brewer in the control of his operations. Before dealing with this part of the subject, it may be well to refer to the important bearing which the nature of the water used has on the quality of the resulting beer. At an early date the town of Burton-on-Trent became celebrated for its pale ales, whilst Dublin and London became almost equally renowned for the excellence of their stouts and porters. Whilst this was to some extent due to differences in the methods of brewing adopted, it was soon recognized that it was chiefly owing to the different character of the water supplies of the respective districts, for even when the same materials and the same methods of brewing were employed, it was found, for example, to be impossible with the London water to brew pale ales having the same character and general excellence as those brewed in Burton, and on the other hand, Burton stouts and porters could not compete with those of London and Dublin. Now the water from the Burton wells is found to contain large quantities of calcium sulphate, about 80 grains per gallon, with smaller proportions of magnesium sulphate, and it is to the presence of these salts, particularly the former, in such comparatively large quantities that the special suitability of the Burton water for the production of pale ales is due. On the other hand, the Dublin water contains little else than the carbonates of calcium and magnesium, and after boiling is consequently very soft, whilst the water from the deep wells in and around London contains sulphates, carbonates, and chlorides of sodium, and is free from the earthy sulphates above referred to. Putting the matter very briefly, it may be said that hard waters containing much calcium sulphate, such as those of Burton, are specially suited for the brewing of pale ales and the better class of bitter beers, whilst soft waters are best for the production of stout and porter. Mild ales and certain other classes of beer require for their production water intermediate in respect of hardness between the two above mentioned classes. Since the composition of the water necessary for the production in their highest excellency of the various classes of beer is well known, it will be clear that much may be done to convert an unsuitable water into a suitable one by artificial treatment, that is to say, by the addition of those mineral ingredients in which it is naturally deficient, or by the decomposition of those ingredients which are undesirable. Whilst the desired result cannot always be brought about by artificial treatment, it is possible, in the great majority of cases, to render certain water supplies much more suitable than they would otherwise have been by the addition of the necessary materials, such as calcium sulphate, gypsum, magnesium sulfate, calcium chloride, etc. Thanks to this knowledge it is now possible to brew pale ales of good quality in many towns other than Burton, and to use natural supplies which would otherwise be unsuitable for the production of certain classes of beer now largely in demand. It should be said that all water intended for brewing purposes, whether hard or soft, must be of a high degree of organic purity. The first actual process within the brewery is the grinding of the malt. This is effected by passing the malt through revolving steel rolls, two pairs being often used side by side, with the rolls set at different distances, the small corns being passed through the one pair and the larger corns through the other. In this way something approaching to uniformity of grinding is obtained. The object of the brewer is not to grind as finely as possible, but to crush each corn thoroughly so as to permit of the ready attack of the starch by the diastase when water is added, and yet to bring about as little disintegration as possible of the husk of the grain which is needed to assist filtration in the mash tun. In certain modern processes of grinding the mealy portion of the grain is separated after crushing by various mechanical devices from the husk, and the former is then more finely ground, with the object of increasing the amount of extractive matter to be obtained from it. But it is not within the scope of this book to deal with working details, and in any case the great majority of brewers still adopt the simpler though less perfect form of grinding machinery above referred to. The malt having been ground or crushed, the brewer is ready to commence the process of mashing. In this process the crushed malt has to be mixed with the requisite amount of water under such conditions of temperature that the action of the diastase on the starch can be kept within certain necessary limits. The vessel in which this action takes place is known as the mash tun. As will be seen by reference to the following diagrammatic drawing, Fig. 1, it consists essentially of a covered cylindrical vessel, constructed usually of wood or iron, fitted with a perforated false bottom, A, revolving rakes or stirring machinery, B, a sparging or washing appliance, C, and a number of pipes for drawing off the resulting clear wort, D. In some cases the admixture of crushed malt, grist, and water is made directly in the mash tun itself, but more frequently a mechanical appliance known as an external masher, E, is used, by means of which a more perfect admixture of the malt and the water can be made, which enables the brewer to maintain a more exact control over the temperature of the mixture, which as we shall shortly see is a matter of the highest importance. It will be remembered that during the process of malting, the whole internal structure of the barley corn is altered in such a way that the starch granules with which the endosperm is packed are rendered more easily amenable to the action of the enzyme diastase when the crushed malt is mixed with water at suitable temperatures. It is generally held that this is due to the disintegration by enzymatic activity of the walls of the vegetable cells in which those granules are formed and contained, and the process is technically referred to as modification. Ungerminated barley contains a form of diastase, the natural function of which appears to be the transference of starch from one part of the growing organism to another. This was termed by Brown and Morris translocation diastase, in contradistinction to the diastase of secretion, which is formed during the germination period. The precise chemical limitations and functions of these two forms of diastase are still